Hey guys, tonight we're stepping into one of history's weirdest fever dreams, a story so full of posh disasters, perfumed scandal, and questionable medical advice that it'll make your last group chat argument about kombucha look like a scholarly debate. Tonight, we're drifting into the scented, swirling fog of Victorian high society, where the only thing more intoxicating than power was the stuff people were actually inhaling. Ether. Yes, ether. The miracle party drug that swept through parlours, drawing rooms, and the trembling hands of England's finest. Imagine, for a moment, the most elite, uptight, overdressed people on earth, all flopping around on velvet sofas, inhaling chemicals, and occasionally forgetting which country they're in. It's 1800. Your dinner party can turn into a rave at any moment. There's not a single safety label in sight. And if anyone asks what you're up to, you just say, "It's medicinal, darling." So before you settle in, take a moment to like and subscribe. But only if you actually enjoy what I do here. Leave a comment telling me where you are listening from and what time it is for you. Now, dim those lights, turn on a fan for that soft, calming hum, and get comfortable. Maybe even tuck your feet in, just in case a hallucinating baronet wanders by. Pause for a second. Have you ever wondered what it actually felt like to be a Victorian aristocrat riding the ether train? How did ether even become the hottest new thing when tea and repression were already so in vogue? Was it really safer than gin? Or did your butler just say that so you'd stop crying on the divan? Did anyone ever spill ether at a royal ball and accidentally invent indoor fog? And if your neighbours were all snorting mystery vapour from ornate glass bottles, how could you tell if you were hosting a séance or just Tuesday brunch? And finally, congratulations. You've just woken up in London, 1847. You're wearing 15 pounds of formal clothing. Your doctor has the bedside manner of a hungover platypus, and someone is passing you a delicate handkerchief soaked in something. Take a deep breath. What's the worst that could happen? Welcome to the most intoxicated chapter of high society you never learned about in school. It's time for introductions. You're at the center of a candlelit Victorian salon, surrounded by rosewater, pomade, and so much perfume that the air is technically flammable. But suddenly, society wants something stronger. Perfume is out, ether is in, and everyone's about to discover what happens when your beauty routine gets replaced by chemistry. Let's set the scene. You, in a sea of frothy petticoats and stiff-collared dinner jackets, drifting through a fog of lavender, sandalwood, and hints of mystery animal. There's a crystal decanter of cologne on the table, a potpourri dish on every surface, and an anxious spaniel underfoot, halfway high just from the fumes. For centuries, this was the Victorian answer to body odour, a problem no amount of rosewater could really conquer. But at least everyone agreed to pretend it worked, until now. Because someone, probably your cousin, who reads too many French novels, has arrived with a vial of clear liquid, and the conviction that tonight is the night to break with tradition. The pitch is simple. It's medicinal. Doctors use it for everything. One sniff, and your nerves will be as calm as a monk in a coma. You look around. The matron by the fire is fanning herself like she's trying to summon rain. The local vicar is already interested, which should be your first warning. You've already survived 1,000 other trends. You've choked down cod liver oil, let a doctor attach leeches to your earlobes, and spent 3 months on the bathing with vinegar experiment. No one talks about the aftermath of that one. Why not ether? Besides, it's a scientific age. The telegraph is a thing. People have opinions about magnets, and nothing says modern quite like trusting your health to something you can't pronounce. So you gather round. The ether is poured onto a lace handkerchief carefully, because it evaporates faster than aristocratic interest in hard work. You raise the cloth to your nose, trying not to think about the fact that your entire social circle is about to do something even the cat finds suspicious. There's a brief, tingling cold, a strange sweetness, and then lift off. The world gets fuzzy at the edges. Conversation slows to syrup. Lady Wilmington is giggling at the wallpaper. You realize with horror that you're also giggling, though you have no idea why. You're not even sure you know your own name. And that's it. The start of the revolution. By midnight, the salon has become an aromatic laboratory. Half the guests are splayed on fainting couches in various states of euphoria. The other half are busy pretending this is perfectly normal. Someone has knocked over a candelabrum, but nobody moves to pick it up. There is a heated debate about whether ether is more civilized than gin, which is funny, because both groups are slurring their words. This is how it spreads. The next day, you'll hear about the marvelous tranquility at Lady Dashwood's gathering. And by the end of the week, even the most skeptical of your friends are sending their butlers to fetch more bottles from the local chemist. Suddenly, the perfume trade is in a panic. What good is lavender water when your rivals are sniffing scientific progress straight from a monogrammed flask? What's the point of musk if your nerves can only be calmed by something that smells like hospital and regret? And so, the great scented arms race begins. The city's perfumers scramble to adapt, mixing ether into rosewater, bottling medicated mists, and creating advertisements promising a most refreshing sensation for the busy socialite. It's only a matter of time before someone starts bottling their own mixture in a bathtub, and an entire parlor spends the night convinced they're floating. You can almost hear the future historians sighing, "This is how the mighty fall," not with a bang, but with a snort and a cloud of vapor, surrounded by discarded perfume bottles and the lingering scent of very bad ideas. And as the embers die low and the scent of ether lingers, you realize you're witnessing the moment perfume lost to progress. And progress, predictably, lost to impulse. Welcome to the revolution. Try not to set your hair on fire. Let's talk about the first time you heard about ether. It wasn't from your doctor, it was from your cousin Cordelia, who claimed it was all the rage in Paris. Within weeks, polite society is passing around glass bottles like after-dinner mints. The servants are baffled, the footmen are alarmed, and the medical journals are, as usual, about 6 years behind. You remember the moment. You're sitting stiff, backed at a respectable London dinner, listening to a gentleman explain why railway timetables are an affront to God, when Cordelia leans over and whispers, "Have you tried the French remedy for nerves?" At first, you assume it's another one of her teas, herbal, questionable, and suspiciously green. But no. She produces a tiny vial, neatly labeled ether sulfurique, and winks. "They're all doing it in Montmartre," she says, as if this is both a recommendation and a threat. At this point, the gatekeepers of good taste, your mother, the Duchess of Gossamer, and the entire Royal College of Physicians are theoretically standing guard over the boundaries of propriety. Their job, to prevent scandalous trends from slithering past the lace curtains and infecting the drawing room. In practice, their main defense is looking disappointed and, occasionally, banning rhubarb at garden parties. They have no idea what's coming. It starts small. Ether arrives as a remedy, whispered about in sick rooms and apothecaries. Your local doctor, who recently recommended powdered oyster shell for anxiety, is suddenly brandishing a bottle of the new miracle. "Just a whiff, and you'll feel as calm as a bishop on a Tuesday," he promises, while the bottle leaks suspiciously into his pocket. You're told ether is scientific, modern, and absolutely not addictive. These are, technically, all lies. The gatekeepers are unprepared. They are used to fighting off the dangers of dancing too vigorously, eating ice cream after sunset, and reading novels without a chaperone. But ether isn't a foreign vice or a working-class problem. It arrives dressed in silk, speaking French, and, crucially, recommended by a doctor with an accent. Nobody can resist a prescription delivered in flawless Parisian. The servants, naturally, are the first to notice that something is off. Mrs. Bradshaw, the housekeeper, catches Lady Charlotte laughing to herself in the conservatory at a fern. The butler finds the youngest son trying to explain the philosophy of cheese to a passing dog. The staff exchange glances, mutter about modern nerves, and double-check the locks on the liquor cabinet. Meanwhile, you're left wondering why all your family portraits suddenly look so judgmental. In the salons, the spread is viral. No respectable hostess wants to be the last to embrace the trend, so ether sneaks onto every invitation list under restoratives. The apothecaries are selling out. Chemists, previously known only for smelling like cabbage and secrecy, become the city's most sought-after party suppliers. Suddenly, it's entirely possible to find yourself at a luncheon where the main course is chicken a la king and the dessert is a cloud of flammable vapor. It's not just the upper crust either. Ether jumps social boundaries with the agility of a cat at a fish market. Young clerks, society matrons, and minor poets are all dabbing their handkerchiefs with the stuff, hoping for inspiration or at least a reprieve from the agony of being alive in the age of horse manure and rigid etiquette. By the time the medical journals publish their first warnings, some mild alarm regarding recent chemical fads, but no need for panic unless your vicar starts levitating. Half the city is already hooked. The final blow to the gatekeepers? Their own curiosity. Before long, even the most resistant members of society are slipping behind the velvet rope, just to see what all the fuss is about. Your uncle, a stern man who once banned Christmas crackers for being too boisterous, is now seen floating blissfully through the garden, muttering that the geraniums are plotting against him. That's how it happens, not with riots, protests, or dark alleys, but with laughter behind closed doors, doctors with a twinkle in their eye, and the slow, delicious thrill of breaking a rule that nobody knows exists yet. The gatekeepers never stood a chance. Ether was in, and by the time anyone noticed, society had already forgotten what it was supposed to be guarding. The year is 1847, and science means anything involving bubbling glass. Ether is the latest miracle, praised by physicians and poets alike. The promise? Instant relief from boredom, nerves, and reality. The side effects? Not mentioned in polite company. Everyone wants a taste, and nobody's reading the fine print. Let's start with the scene. Gaslight flickers over marble busts and overstuffed sofas, and everyone who's anyone claims to know a little chemistry. Your neighbor's cousin, who once visited the British Museum, is now an authority on every jar in the apothecary. It's the golden age of scientific optimism, when a white lab coat means never having to say you're sorry for exploding the kitchen. And in the middle of all this progress, society has fallen head over heels for a substance that literally evaporates if you leave the lid off too long. For the Victorian upper crust, ether isn't just a medicine, it's a sensation. There's a delicious thrill to the idea that you, a respectable person in a starched collar, might inhale something that makes you forget which fork to use at supper. In a world where even laughter can be dangerous if it rattles the china, ether is the ticket to temporary anarchy. It's rebellion, but with excellent posture. The scientific establishment, never ones to let a good bandwagon roll by without jumping on, are quick to endorse ether. Medical journals churn out enthusiastic reports. A most peculiar calm observed in the patient following inhalation, followed by hysterical laughter and spontaneous waltzing. Surgeons, eager to be on the cutting edge, begin using it in their procedures. The results are mixed. Some patients wake up marveling at the wonders of modern medicine. Others wake up convinced they've been chased by ghostly sheep. Meanwhile, in the drawing rooms, everyone is a budding scientist. Handkerchiefs are doused, stopwatches are produced, and bets are placed on who can remain standing the longest after a generous sniff. The phrase for medicinal purposes covers a multitude of sins. If you pass out, it's not because you're a lightweight, it's because you're a pioneer. Your grandmother claims it soothes her palpitations. Your younger brother claims he saw the future. Your father, who once scoffed at modern fads, is now requesting that the butler air out his study after every dinner party. Of course, not everything goes according to plan. There are a few hiccups. It turns out that pouring ether near open flames is a poor idea, but it takes 3 small kitchen fires and 1 scorched piano to really drive the lesson home. Sometimes, guests inhale too enthusiastically and spend the evening attempting to recite Latin poetry to the wallpaper. Every household develops its own set of emergency protocols, most of which involve lying on the fainting couch and hoping nobody tells the vicar. As the sensation spreads, so does the hysteria. Newspapers alternate between breathless praise and dire warnings. Society threatened by new fad. Are our daughters safe? Moralists, clutching at the last threads of decency, warn that ether will unravel the very fabric of civilization. This is before anyone invents jazz. So the bar for moral collapse is still quite low. Public lectures are held. Physicians argue passionately with ministers. The only people who seem entirely unconcerned are the chemists, who are now able to afford larger hats. But even in the swirl of anxiety, ether has become the new measure of progress. If you're not at least pretending to understand its scientific properties, you risk being labeled backward, old-fashioned, or worst of all, dull. Invitations to ether parties become a new currency. Everyone's neighbor is an expert, everyone's physician is an enthusiast, and even the most somber of uncles now nod knowingly when the word sulfuric is mentioned. So here you are, poised between progress and panic, science and sensation. You're not entirely sure whether you're living in an age of enlightenment or just the world's longest group experiment. But you do know one thing. Nobody is bored. The quest for scientific understanding has rarely been this exhilarating, or this likely to end with someone snoring into a potted plant. Welcome to Victorian science, where the only thing greater than discovery is denial, and where, for a brief, intoxicating moment, sensation trumps sense, and everyone's a little hysterical. It's Saturday night, and the most exclusive invitation in town isn't to a ball, it's to an ether frolic. The dress code, formal despair. The activity, inhaling vapor until you can't feel your monocle. The food, mostly untouched because everyone is busy giggling at the wallpaper. Let's step inside. A row of carriages clogs the street outside the most fashionable townhouse in Mayfair. Inside, the air is thick with anticipation and several legally questionable fumes. Gilt mirrors gleam in the candlelight, and every available surface is draped in damask. Guests arrive in their finery, swaddled in silks and lace, each secretly hoping no one notices that their hands are already trembling with anticipation. This is not your average soiree. This is a night for letting your starches down. You're greeted at the door by a butler who is definitely pretending he's not worried about the open flames near the entertainment table. In the parlor, decanters of ether sit next to the port, flanked by cut glass bowls of dried rose petals and a few nervous canapes. The host, always someone with more money than sense, raises a glass and announces, "Let us indulge in the wonders of chemistry." The crowd cheers, although it's unclear whether anyone actually heard the speech or just got a whiff a little early. The evening begins with decorum, as every Victorian gathering must. Gentlemen debate parliamentary procedure while eyeing the ether bottle. Ladies discuss embroidery with the wild-eyed intensity of those plotting escape. Soon, someone cracks. Usually it's a minor baroness who's had a rough week. She reaches for a handkerchief, soaks it generously, and in less than a minute she's giggling into her shawl and declaring her undying love for the ceiling rose. That's all it takes. Suddenly, the dam bursts. Ether-soaked cloths pass from hand to hand, and respectable matrons are soon found sprawled on fainting couches, recounting childhood memories they may or may not have invented. Sir Percival, who hasn't laughed since the Corn Laws, is now snorting with glee as he tries to teach a spaniel to poker. Meanwhile, the ether does what it does best, lowers inhibitions, dissolves dignity, and inspires bizarre party games. Someone suggests charades. 5 minutes later, Three viscounts are reenacting the Battle of Trafalgar with a soup ladle and an ornamental vase. Someone else proposes guess the smell, which ends poorly after Lady Foxton confuses the ether for her lemon hand lotion and spends the rest of the night trying to speak French. The host's staff, veterans of 1,000 awkward dinner parties, move quietly among the revelers, righting toppled side tables and gently removing the occasional unconscious earl from the center of the rug. The footman tasked with refilling the decanters is now a local legend. Rumour has it he once revived the entire ladies' auxiliary with a single whiff. Meanwhile, the cook waits anxiously in the kitchen, listening to the distant sound of spontaneous laughter and hoping the veal will survive until someone remembers to eat. In one corner, the family doctor stands by with an air of resigned professionalism. He dispenses just a dash more, for science, to anyone who asks, all the while calculating how long he can stay before he's called away to tend to another fainting spell. When pressed for his professional opinion, he shrugs and mutters something about the future of medicine before wandering off to check on a group of young men reciting poetry to the grandfather clock. The ether party is, above all, an equalizer. Titles and fortunes don't matter much when everyone is horizontal, and half the crowd thinks the wallpaper is whispering secrets. By midnight, the parlour has become a nest of softly snoring aristocrats, their dreams full of swirling colours, improbable adventures, and absolutely no memory of what happened to the soup. And in the stillness, as the candles gutter and the ether dissipates, you can't help but think, this is history in the making. A brief, extravagant rebellion against boredom, an absurd chapter written in perfume and vapour. Victorian society will tidy itself up by sunrise. But for a few wild hours, you got to see what happens when the rules evaporate. For Victorian women, ether is freedom in a bottle finally. Something more exciting than embroidery. Inhale, and suddenly your corset feels optional, your suitor looks interesting, and you don't care what Lady Muse thinks. For a brief dizzy moment, being delicate is actually fun. Let's set the stage. You are a lady of good breeding, which mostly means you are tired, over-supervised, and on a steady diet of boiled turnips and social anxiety. Every morning you're laced into a garment, engineered by sadists, then told to keep your opinions soft and your wrists even softer. Your life is a daily schedule of sitting rooms, chaperoned walks, and learning to faint convincingly enough to escape Aunt Prudence's lectures on moral fibre. There's needlepoint, there's piano practice, and if you're very lucky, there's gossip about someone else's failed courtship. Enter ether, a tiny bottle of scandal wrapped in the veneer of modern medicine. At first, it arrives as a whisper, a remedy for nerves and female hysteria, those mysterious afflictions that seem to be caused by having too many thoughts or not enough cake. The family doctor, who, let's be honest, prescribes laudanum for everything from heartbreak to stubbed toes, starts recommending ether for your delicate constitution. Your mother feigns concern but is secretly curious. Your cousin has already tried it twice and claims it's the only way she survived last season's poetry readings. The first time you try it is at a tea party. It's all giggles and porcelain clatter, but underneath the lace, everyone is tense, an unspoken contest of whose gloves are whitest and whose sighs are most dramatic. Someone produces a bottle of ether for a touch of melancholy, and suddenly the real party begins. A discreet dab on a handkerchief, a quick sniff, and the room dissolves into laughter and secret confessions. The world softens around the edges. Even the vicar's jokes seem funny. Ether, for women, is a quiet revolution. It blurs the boundaries of decorum. No longer are you just performing frailty, you're floating in it. The rules loosen. For a moment, you're allowed to speak your mind, to laugh too loudly, to ignore the constant monitoring of your posture and your thoughts. You swap stories with your friends, confess minor scandals, and even admit that you sometimes wish you could run away and become a governess in Vienna or, even better, a stage actress. Scandalous, yes, but who's going to judge? Lady Museley is halfway through an ether-induced story about the time she once ran barefoot through the rain. The men, of course, are baffled. They stand on the periphery of these gatherings, nervously clearing their throats and pretending to read the newspaper. Occasionally one is invited to join the ladies, and he spends the entire afternoon in awe as the women, usually so reserved, devolve into giggling philosophers. The more conservative matrons disapprove, but even they have to admit that family dinners are much more interesting now that someone has confessed to stealing the cook's brandy. There's a practical side, too. Ether is convenient, easy to hide in a reticule, impossible for a chaperone to monitor, and fast-acting enough to bring genuine relief from the relentless weight of expectations. Some women use it to get through interminable evenings of dull suitors and sermons about duty. Others treat it as a social ritual, a little secret shared between sisters, cousins, and friends. One drop for courage, one drop for camaraderie. Of course, the whispers eventually reach the men in charge. Concerned husbands and fathers commission articles in the newspapers warning of the dangers of female overexcitement. They consult doctors who, depending on the size of the consulting fee, either denounce ether as the end of civilization or quietly pocket a bottle for their own wives. But it's too late. The ether genie is out of the bottle, and no amount of moralizing will put it back. For Victorian women, ether is more than a fad. It's a breath of rebellion, a chance to be bold, be silly, and be, for a moment, completely unbothered by the endless tangle of rules. For once, being delicate is powerful, and languishing is the best fun you've ever had. You're a man of property, you own several hats, but tonight, you're faced with a new social question. Do you take the ether, or do you remain a paragon of restraint? Half the room is giggling uncontrollably, the other half is trying to light cigars and failing. This is what progress looks like. Let's set the scene. The gentlemen have retreated to the library, that wood-panelled temple to good taste and even better brandy. The air is thick with cigar smoke and quiet bravado. On the mahogany table, nestled among crystal decanters and scandalous French novels, sits an unassuming bottle of ether. For a moment, everyone pretends not to notice it. They debate parliamentary reform, discuss cricket scores no one really remembers, and recount the one time they almost met Charles Dickens. But eventually, the topic shifts, as it always does, to the latest sensation sweeping the salons, ether. For the Victorian gentleman, the dilemma is real. Do you partake in this fashionable scientific miracle and risk your dignity, or do you scoff at the trend and risk looking hopelessly old-fashioned? Lord Bletchley, always the first to try anything imported or explosive, claims it's the best thing since starched collars. He waves his handkerchief and offers a demonstration, inhaling deeply and, within seconds, attempting to quote Shakespeare while simultaneously unbuttoning his waistcoat and complimenting the rug. The room splits. Half the men, inspired by Bletchley's courage, or perhaps the possibility of escaping the evening's third discussion of corn tariffs, follow suit. They dab their handkerchiefs, take a tentative sniff, and soon the library is alive with undignified laughter. Sir Gerald, who last smiled in 1839, is hiccuping in a wingback chair, insisting he's discovered a new colour. Someone else tries to recount his years at Oxford but gets stuck on the word quadrangle and never escapes. It's as if every repressed chuckle, every politely swallowed complaint comes bubbling out in one grand ether-fueled release. But not everyone is convinced. The traditionalists cling to their pipes and their skepticism. A real man doesn't need artificial stimulants, declares Colonel Swithins, whose definition of a good time hasn't evolved since the Crimean War. He glares at the ether bottle as if it personally owes him money. There's talk of moral decay, of the importance of self-control, and the decline of British grit. Someone mutters something about the French, and for a brief moment, everyone agrees that the French are probably to blame. The pressure is palpable. Refusing the ether can feel like admitting you have something to hide, Or worse, that you're afraid of fun. But partaking means risking your carefully cultivated reputation as a man of discipline. It's a high-wire act, balanced between stoic composure and the tantalizing promise of a few minutes' escape from the crushing weight of gentlemanly expectations. Of course, there's an element of competition. Who can take the biggest whiff without toppling over? Who can recite Latin backwards, or keep a straight face while everyone else is howling at nothing? Wagers are placed, rules are invented, and the normally somber library becomes a scene of mild chaos. For once, being a man of the world means surrendering to nonsense, if only for a night. Meanwhile, the butler stands by, resigned, polishing glasses with the same cloth he uses to mop up the occasional spill. He's seen worse, much worse, if you count the incident with the absinthe and the parrot, but he's quietly rooting for the men to come to their senses before someone tries to ride the billiards table to freedom. As the ether fades and the room quiets, the men slowly recover their composure. There are embarrassed coughs, sheepish grins, and a hurried return to the comfort of port and self-deprecating jokes. But something has changed. For a brief, vaporous hour, the gentlemen have experienced true freedom, the right to be ridiculous. And maybe, just maybe, progress isn't such a bad thing after all, especially if it comes with laughter, a little humility, and the sudden realization that even the stiffest upper lip needs to wobble sometimes. It's 8 a.m. The birds are singing, and your head feels like a misplaced science experiment. You vaguely remember dancing on a piano and debating the finer points of taxidermy. The only thing left is the lingering scent of ether and a deep, unshakable sense of existential dread. The morning after an ether party is nothing like the genteel Victorian breakfasts you see in paintings. Instead of sunlight streaming through spotless windows onto crisp linen, you wake up to a room that smells faintly of burning wool and misplaced ambition. There's an overturned chair by the fireplace. A half-eaten custard tart clings to the curtains. Someone's left a glove in the teapot. All perfectly normal. If you live in a state of mild chemical confusion, you sit up and immediately regret it. Your head is simultaneously too heavy and too light, like it's full of wet cotton and misplaced regrets. The mirror across the room reflects a pale figure with wild hair and the haunted eyes of someone who just remembered reciting love poetry to a houseplant. Your mouth tastes like a blend of rosewater, brandy, and last night's poor decisions. As you grope for a sense of dignity, or at least your left shoe, the household begins to stir. Downstairs, the cook is threatening to quit again, after finding a trail of cheese leading to the library. The butler is carefully picking playing cards out of the soup tureen. In the hallway, a distant relative is still fast asleep on a pile of antimacassars, snoring the smug, contented snore of someone who hasn't yet remembered that they spent a good part of last night attempting to teach the spaniel to poker. Breakfast is served. Normally, this would be a social occasion, a parade of toast, soft-boiled eggs, polite conversation, and at least one person pretending not to be hungover. But today, the atmosphere is different. The guests shuffle to the table in slow motion, clutching cups of coffee like survivors of a shipwreck. Eye contact is avoided at all costs. Nobody mentions the previous night. Not the dancing, not the impromptu monologue about Napoleon's favorite biscuits, certainly not the ether. Still, there's an odd camaraderie in the air, a sense that, for better or worse, everyone has been through something together. Lady Fothergill, usually the embodiment of reserve, lets out a snort of laughter at the sight of Sir Lionel's new haircut, which may or may not have happened after midnight. Even the strictest aunt in the house seems a little softer, sipping her tea with the quiet resignation of a woman who has decided to forgive herself, if only for today. Of course, the physical side effects are less forgiving. Ether, it turns out, is not known for its gentle wake-up call. There's a dull ache behind your eyes, a tingling in your fingers, and the unsettling sensation that your internal organs are conducting a quiet protest. The family doctor is summoned, looking a bit worse for wear himself. He prescribes rest, a brisk walk, and absolutely no more vapor for a fortnight. No one listens, obviously. The only ones unaffected are the children and pets, who seem energized by the chaos. The youngest cousin is still wearing 3 cravats and a lampshade, announcing his candidacy for Parliament. The cat, as always, looks judgmental. By mid-morning, the memory of the party begins to fade. Guests disperse, some to nap, some to nurse regrets, and a few brave souls to actually read the newspaper and see if any new etiquette rules have been invented overnight. The staff quietly restores order, erasing the evidence of debauchery with the efficient resignation of people who have seen it all before. And you? You resolve to avoid ether forever, or at least until the next invitation arrives, promising good company and just a harmless sniff. After all, it's only polite. Welcome to the Victorian morning after. A little older, a little wiser, and just sober enough to remember why you only do this once a week. Ether started out as a wonder drug, anesthesia, a tonic, a miracle. Soon, it was being handed out like party favors at every ailment, real or imagined. Sprained ankle? Ether. Broken heart? Ether. Bad poetry? Try a double dose. Let's rewind to the beginning, when the ether craze was born not in the back rooms of shady apothecaries, but in the well-lit, deeply self-assured offices of Victorian medicine, in a world where the best a doctor could offer was leeches, vinegar baths, or a slap on the back. Ether arrived like a celestial gift. Here, at last, was a substance that seemed to work instantly. The first time a London surgeon waved a dripping rag over a nervous patient and watched him drift off to dreamland, the city lost its collective mind. Medical progress, it seemed, could be bottled. Word spread fast. Within a year, every doctor worth his salt, and several who weren't, was prescribing ether. Not just for operations, but for everything. It was recommended for coughs, melancholy, female troubles, and the ever-mysterious diagnosis of nerves. Victorian Britain ran on nerves, a condition brought on by tight waistbands, aggressive wallpaper, and the stress of pretending to enjoy boiled mutton. Ether, the medical journals insisted, was a safe scientific solution to the constant hum of anxiety. At first, ether was the exclusive domain of the upper classes, administered in drawing rooms by physicians who looked suspiciously cheerful for men surrounded by so many sick people. A good doctor always travelled with an ether bottle in his bag, nestled between smelling salts and a copy of Galen for gentlemen. Some even advertised their skills in the newspaper. Headaches banished, hysteria cured, discreet visits arranged, ether provided. The lines between treatment and recreation blurred quickly. Society ladies claimed to need ether for fainting spells and minor complaints. But it was hard not to notice that the spells always coincided with garden parties or particularly dull musical recitals. Gentlemen sought relief from the pressures of empire and estate. Or, failing that, from a long evening stuck next to Lord Wroxham at dinner. It didn't take long for the side effects to appear. The first signs were small, someone forgetting their own name at a family supper, or a duchess suddenly convinced her lapdog was reciting Shakespeare. But soon, the problems became harder to ignore. Dinner parties ended with guests sprawled across the furniture, not from boredom, but from a potent combination of too much ether and not enough common sense. Rumors spread of entire households knocked out before dessert. Doctors tried to reassure the public. Completely safe in moderation, they intoned, while discreetly pocketing bottles for their own research. Behind the scenes, however, panic was beginning to stir. Letters poured in from worried patients. My husband believes he is a cloud. Mother has not stopped singing since Whitsuntide. Is it normal for my uncle to sleep in the coal scuttle? Even the most enthusiastic practitioners had to admit things were getting out of hand. But the demand didn't drop. Instead, it grew. Soon, ether was sold in every chemist's shop. Housewives kept it on the mantelpiece. Poets swore by its powers of inspiration. Politicians discreetly took a whiff before parliamentary debates, hoping it might make the Chancellor of the Exchequer sound interesting. That's when the regrets truly began. The Royal College of Physicians released a statement warning of deplorable consequences. Cartoonists had a field day, drawing doctors fleeing clouds of ether like startled pheasants. At parties, the phrase "doctor's orders" became a running joke, usually muttered just before someone fell face first into the punch bowl. The great medical hope had become a punchline. Ether, once hailed as the miracle of the age, now came with a side order of chaos and regret. And somewhere, in 1,000 tidy homes, doctors nursed their own headaches and quietly switched to gin, because nothing in history spreads faster than a bad idea wrapped in a doctor's handwriting. Nothing says romance like shared intoxication. Victorian courtship was already awkward, but now everyone's fainting for real. Marriage proposals get weird, love letters become illegible, and the most popular wedding gift is a monogrammed ether bottle. To set the scene, it's a damp London evening, and you, a hopeful suitor, have been invited to an exclusive salon. You've polished your boots, memorized 3 acceptable compliments for a lady's hair, and practiced the art of brooding near the pianoforte. You arrive, only to find that the usual tedium of parlor games and forced small talk has been replaced by a new social ritual, passing around the ether. The room hums with nervous laughter as the first handkerchief is soaked and offered to the bravest heart. Victorian romance, in theory, is a carefully choreographed dance, full of coded glances, chaperoned walks, and endless talk of weather. In practice, it's a mess of nerves and unspoken hopes, all made worse by social rules so complex they require a flowchart. Now, add ether to the equation, and the results are nothing short of spectacular. The shyest debutante in the room is suddenly the loudest, declaring her love for Lord Byron and challenging anyone who doubts her to a duel in French. Suitors who spent weeks rehearsing clever witticisms end up reciting nursery rhymes and giggling so hard they nearly swallow their cufflinks. A new etiquette emerges. The question is no longer, "May I offer you some punch?" but "Would you care for a whiff?" Accepting a handkerchief becomes a secret signal, a Victorian version of swiping right. If your intended laughs instead of swooning, you know you've found a kindred spirit. If she faints, at least it's not from boredom this time. Even seasoned matchmakers are baffled. The old strategies no longer apply. Carefully planned moonlit walks are replaced by spontaneous poetry readings, sometimes addressed to the family dog. Engagement rings are occasionally lost in the upholstery. The phrase "swept off her feet" takes on a much more literal meaning. The poetry of ether romance is questionable. Love letters, usually so florid and overwrought, become masterpieces of incoherence. "Dearest Penelope, your eyes remind me of mist and possibly soup," writes one hopeful beau, before spilling ink all over his lapel and falling asleep halfway through his sonnet. Lady Evelina receives 7 proposals in one night, none of which she remembers, and wakes to find a bouquet of slightly chewed parsley on her pillow. Parents and chaperones, always the last to catch on, attempt to restore order. Mothers warn their daughters of the dangers of vaporous attachments. Fathers patrol the hallways, looking for young men carrying suspicious bottles. The family physician is called in to supervise, but is soon found enthusiastically debating Aristotle with the coat rack. Even the vicar is compromised, having accidentally inhaled while delivering a sermon on the dangers of modernity. But there's a gentle irony at play. For all the chaos, ether romance is the most honest courtship society has seen in years. The masks slip. The practiced lines and icy manners dissolve into laughter, candor, and the occasional duet sung off-key in the conservatory. Real feelings, usually crushed beneath 3 layers of etiquette, begin to emerge. Lady Georgina confesses that she's always hated embroidery. Sir Charles admits that he writes poetry about potatoes. 2 young lovers, previously paralyzed by shyness, find themselves holding hands and making plans to run away and open a bakery in Bath. Of course, not all matches survive the morning after. Some promises, made in a haze of euphoria, are quietly renegotiated over weak tea and apologies. But for those brief, glittering nights, romance is alive in the ether, chaotic, unpredictable, and real in a way Victorian society rarely allows. In the end, ether becomes the patron saint of ill-advised proposals and grand declarations. If love is madness, then surely the Victorians have finally discovered the cure. And it's waiting in a cut glass bottle on the mantelpiece. Downstairs, the staff has seen it all. As the gentry swoon and hallucinate, butlers develop a sixth sense for catching falling viscounts, and maids invent new methods for discreetly airing out the drawing room. Behind every ether disaster is a servant quietly judging their employer. It starts as a whisper among the housemaids. A new craze upstairs. Bottles and handkerchiefs, changing hands like secret messages. For a household servant in Victorian England, nothing is ever really a secret for long. Ether, they note, smells sharper than any cologne and lingers in the curtains for days. The scullery maid is the first to comment, scrunching her nose and muttering, "The master's friends have brought another one of their modern airs." And now, the cat won't come in. The staff is used to cleaning up after fads. They've survived the era of Turkish cigarettes, laudanum cough syrup, and whatever that health broth phase was that turned the drawing room rugs green. But ether presents a whole new challenge. After the first ether party, the butler finds Lord Wyndham snoring in the billiards room, draped over the table like a beached walrus. The parlourmaid, trying to dust around an unconscious debutante, wonders out loud if this is what progress smells like. Servants quickly develop coping strategies. The butler keeps a discreet stash of strong coffee ready for post-party emergencies, and quietly signals the kitchen to keep a pot of restorative broth simmering through the night. The head housemaid opens every window at dawn, braving the wrath of any guest who wakes up shivering and confused, convinced they've fallen asleep in a barn. Maids become experts at removing ether stains from lace and scrubbing mysterious footprints off the mahogany without ever asking who or what left them. They hear things too, bits of ether-induced poetry drifting down the stairwell, heated debates about the best way to seduce a rhododendron, the unmistakable thump of someone attempting to waltz solo in the upstairs corridor. The staff is sworn to discretion, but there's always a risk. An overheard scandal, a misplaced letter, a secret romance revealed in a fit of giggles. And yet, they keep the secrets. After all, a well-timed silence is the currency of the servant class. Occasionally, the boundaries blur. The footman might be persuaded to sample a harmless whiff when invited by a flirtatious guest. The cook, usually immune to fashion, takes a sniff and spends half the evening serenading the soup tureen. For the most part, though, the staff keeps their distance, observing with the weary wisdom of those who know that every fashion has its price, and that someone else will always be left to sweep up the aftermath. As ether becomes a fixture of the household, the servants adapt. The housekeeper updates her list of extra cleaning duties. Air the parlours, check for unconscious guests before locking up, and never, ever let the dog into the library after midnight. There are new codes, new signals, and a thriving underground network for swapping tips on how to revive a countess or remove the scent of ether from velvet curtains. But with adaptation comes power. The servants, always underestimated, know more about the household than anyone upstairs ever realizes. They know which guests are likely to faint, who always sneaks an extra handkerchief, and which heirloom vase was truly broken by the cat. Spoiler, it wasn't the cat. The butler becomes a master of timing, ushering guests out at just the right moment to preserve dignity and avoid questions. At the end of the night, as the gentry drift off to sleep or to uneasy dreams, the servants remain awake a little longer, restoring order and rewriting the record of what actually happened. Tomorrow, the household will wake to neat rooms, fresh linens, and no trace of chaos, except, perhaps, for the knowing glance shared over the breakfast service. For in every Victorian house touched by ether, it's the servants who truly run the show, keeping the secrets, cleaning the mess, and holding the very fabric of society together, one bewildered baronet at a time. Ever tried mixing flammable vapor with candles and bad decisions? Victorian homes did it nightly. The only thing more surprising than the sound of a chandelier falling was realizing nobody had invented a fire extinguisher yet. Let's be honest, for all their talk of progress, Victorians had a habit of introducing new technology without considering such minor details as safety. And nothing captured this spirit better than the great ether experiment, conducted nightly in salons, libraries, and, on at least one occasion, the conservatory, where the ferns are still traumatized. It turns out that when you add a highly flammable anesthetic to a house full of open flames, silk curtains, and distracted aristocrats, you get not so much scientific advancement as a recipe for chaos. It always starts with good intentions. The host, eager to impress, wants to demonstrate the latest in modern chemistry. Observe, dear friends, the marvels of ether, he announces, while an unfortunate footman stands by with a tray of handkerchiefs. Everyone gathers around, squabbling politely over who gets to inhale first. Candles flicker in the draught from an open window, and the gas lamps hum ominously in the background. The butler's eye twitches. The first mishaps are small, a dropped handkerchief here, a glass of claret spilled there. Lady Agnes leans too close to the fire and singes her fringe, which, according to the local hairdresser, is the most exciting thing to happen to her all year. A young gentleman, attempting to impress his peers, decides to see what happens if you pour ether into a glass and light it. The answer, for those keeping score, is a brief, enthusiastic fireball and the loss of one very good moustache. The chaos ramps up quickly. Someone faints a little too close to the marble bust of Homer, resulting in a loud crash and a nose that will never be the same again. The host's prized Persian rug now sports a suspiciously sticky patch where ether, punch, and possibly some kind of dessert collided in a perfect storm of negligence. The dog, meanwhile, has developed an unwise fondness for ether-soaked handkerchiefs and is discovered later sleeping upside down in the coal scuttle. But the true disasters involve the combination of ether and the ever-present flame. Victorian homes are full of hazards, candles on every surface, oil lamps perched on mantelpieces, and fireplaces roaring even in July. Tradition, after all, is non-negotiable. All it takes is a distracted guest waving an ether-soaked kerchief too close to the candelabra, and suddenly everyone is treated to an impromptu pyrotechnics display. The results range from scorched tablecloths to the rapid unveiling of bald spots, as gentlemen frantically pat out their singed hair. It isn't just fire, either. Ether can leave people dizzy, confused, and clumsy, hardly ideal in a world full of porcelain figurines and antique glassware. Whole evenings have been lost to the sound of shattering vases, toppled screens, and the faint but unmistakable wail of a maid discovering that someone has mistaken the umbrella stand for a chamber pot. Medical mishaps are common too. More than one guest has woken up on the floor, convinced they've been transported to another dimension, only to find themselves tangled in the fringed edge of a Turkish carpet. Of course, the aftermath is a lesson in Victorian discretion. Guests smooth their hair, dust off the debris, and assure their host that they quite enjoyed the spectacle. The staff, ever resourceful, rushes to cover burn marks with strategically placed potted palms. The doctor, who arrived late and missed the explosions, prescribes fresh air and a calming sherry. The next day, the host is left to survey the damage. Scorched curtains, broken heirlooms, and the distinct aroma of singed pride. But no matter, the invitations for the next ether frolic are already being written, for in Victorian England, science always moves forward, even if it occasionally sets the parlour on fire along the way. Even the nursery isn't safe. Curious children find the ether stash, and suddenly the governess is reading bedtime stories to a group of toddlers convinced they're floating above the Thames. Victorian parenting, still a work in progress. To set the scene, imagine the grand townhouse at dusk. Upstairs, the grown-ups are gathered in the drawing room, lost in laughter, vapor, and increasingly abstract conversation. Down the hall, in a sunlit nursery trimmed with lace and stuffed animals that all seem to have slightly judgmental eyes, a new adventure is unfolding. It starts, as these things do, with curiosity and an unlocked cabinet. Master Archie, age 7, has already been caught twice this week, experimenting with the effects of treacle on clockwork mice. Now, with the mysterious glass bottles left unattended on the hall table, the children are about to expand their scientific inquiries in bold new directions. Ether, to a Victorian child, is basically a magic potion. The label says, for nerves. But what could be more nerve-wracking than a spelling lesson, or worse, another forced performance on the pianoforte? Miss Jane, age 9, points out that adults seem to enjoy ether quite a lot, and that anything hidden from children must be either dangerous or highly desirable. After a quick, whispered vote, the decision is made. A little experiment is in order. The application is predictably haphazard. A doll's bonnet is soaked, a napkin is dabbed, and soon the nursery smells like a combination of lavender, sachet, birthday candles, and poor judgment. Within minutes, the results begin. The twins claim to see colors that aren't invented yet. Archie tries to convince his younger sister that she has turned into a particularly elegant flamingo. The cat bolts under the bed, and the nursery maid, entering with a tray of boiled sweets, is greeted by 3 children attempting to float by holding onto the curtain tassels. The governess, long-suffering and underpaid, walks in to find absolute mayhem. It's a scene of cheerful anarchy, one child trying to recite Latin backwards, another gently spinning in circles while singing about steamboats, and a third gazing out the window and announcing she can see the entire empire from here. The room is a riot of giggles, scattered toys, and one overturned footstool. The governess, torn between horror and the faint urge to laugh, immediately sets about restoring order with all the sternness she can muster. She threatens to write to every parent, uncle, and godparent in the address book, though she quietly admits to herself that the sight of Archie attempting to salute the wallpaper is something she'll treasure forever. Once order is restored and everyone is corralled into their beds, the aftermath is surprisingly peaceful. The ether, like so many Victorian fads, is fleeting in its effect, and the children drift into deep, dreamless sleep. The governess, grateful for the quiet, wonders whether ether has been secretly used in nurseries for years. It certainly seems more effective than bedtime stories about obedient foxes or the glories of the British Empire. By morning, the incident is already halfway to legend. The children whisper conspiratorially at breakfast, inventing ever more elaborate tales about their voyage through the clouds. Master Archie, future barrister or train robber, depending on who you ask, quietly pockets a handkerchief for future research. The cat continues to avoid the nursery, just in case. Meanwhile, the adults remain blissfully unaware. As they debate the finer points of poetry and vapor in the drawing room, their children have become pioneers in the art of questionable decision-making. The staff, of course, are the only ones truly in the know. The nursemaid leaves an extra cup of strong tea for the governess, and the housekeeper quietly moves the ether bottles to a higher shelf. Victorian society prided itself on order, discipline, and propriety. Yet in the heart of every great house, rebellion was already brewing, sometimes wearing pinafores and always keeping an eye out for the next forbidden adventure. Because no matter the age, when it comes to curiosity and chaos, children are the true inheritors of the Victorian spirit. Ether wasn't just a party trick. The medical establishment got in on the action, prescribing it for everything from nerves to female hysteria. Apothecaries did brisk business, and nobody asked too many questions about the ingredients. It all began with good intentions, as these things usually do. The Victorians, desperate for remedies to the countless ailments that plagued their nervous, overworked society, embraced the medical marvel of ether with open arms. Surgeons hailed it as a wonder for pain relief. Family doctors added it to their arsenal of cures right next to leeches, mustard plasters, and the ever-popular tonic of sherry mixed with hope. What could possibly go wrong? The result was an explosion of new suppliers. The neighborhood apothecary, previously best known for dispensing cough drops that tasted like old boots, became the center of high society's newest obsession. Behind the counter, jars of powders and mysterious liquids jostled for space as ether took pride of place. The process of acquiring it was absurdly simple. Step 1. Develop a vague complaint. Doctor, I find myself occasionally melancholy at tea. Step 2. Wait as the chemist nods wisely and produces a small bottle from under the counter. Step 3. Accept your medicine with a wink and the unspoken agreement that nobody needs to mention it to father. The doctors themselves were an odd bunch. There were the earnest men in spectacles, genuinely hoping to help their patients, and there were the fashionable physicians who made house calls with silk-lined bags and egos to match. Some developed a reputation for being a bit too enthusiastic in their demonstrations, leaving society women faint and society men unusually philosophical about the nature of chairs. It's rumored that one particularly flamboyant physician, Dr. Percival Street, John, held private therapeutic salons in which the main therapy involved passing the bottle and discussing the finer points of romantic poetry. Then there were the dandies, the young, fashion-obsessed men who seized upon ether as the latest way to distinguish themselves from the ordinary crowd. Their goal, to be seen snubbing sherry in favor of vapor and to perfect the art of fainting gracefully on demand. The dandies' evening kit included not just a perfectly tied cravat, but a monogrammed ether flask and a repertoire of stories about how continental society was doing it much more stylishly in Paris. If you could deliver a clever bon mot right before swooning, so much the better. But not all ether flowed through reputable hands. Where there's demand, there's always a supply, and where there's a supply, there are dubious characters lurking in alleyways, ready to sell whatever passes for the real thing. Fake apothecaries popped up overnight, their shops filled with watered-down bottles and mixtures that smelled suspiciously like turpentine. Newspapers began to report incidents of accidental poisoning. The criminal underworld quickly realized that there was good money in supplying the desperate, the curious, and the perpetually bored. If you weren't careful, the soothing vapor you purchased might leave you not soothed, but violently ill, or simply missing your pocket watch. Still, for many, the risk was part of the thrill. Ether parties began to include a competitive element. Whose bottle came from the most exclusive supplier? Who had the purest vapor, the most daring story of acquisition? The line between medical marvel and social status symbol blurred, until it all became a single, heady swirl of fashion, chemistry, and poor decision-making. By the end of the ether craze, doctors were issuing stern warnings, apothecaries were nervously double-checking their labels, and the dandies were already sniffing around for the next big thing. But for a brief, extraordinary moment, everyone in Victorian high society, from the most respected surgeon to the shadiest street vendor, had their hands in the ether jar. And as always, no one quite knew whether they were curing society or simply making it much, much stranger. Rumor has it that even the royal family dabbled in the new fad. If true, it's the only time a British monarch was both ruler and the life of the party. At the palace, etiquette is strictly enforced, unless someone drops the ether bottle, in which case all bets are off. To set the scene, it's a chilly evening at Buckingham Palace, and the halls are bustling with liveried footmen, anxious equerries, and a menagerie of courtiers attempting to look both fashionable and faintly terrified. Queen Victoria herself sits at the head of a table so long it requires its own postal system. On the surface, everything is exactly as it should be. Rigid formality, measured conversation, and the slow, steady passing of soup. But beneath the surface, there's a buzz. Something new is circulating among the royal set. It begins innocently, as these things always do. Prince Albert, ever the modernizer, has heard about the latest medical marvel from the continent and is keen to impress his wife and her retinue. Ether, he declares, is the future of both science and personal tranquility. He's even had it delivered by royal courier, ensuring it arrives with more fanfare than most minor dukes. The court physician, eager to please and not entirely immune to peer pressure, demonstrates its therapeutic value by offering a discreet sniff to the Duchess of Kent, who promptly declares herself vastly improved. Soon, ether is being offered with the same solemnity as the best sherry. A line of glass bottles, monogrammed with the royal crest, appears beside the silver teapots. The ladies in waiting exchange glances, half scandalized, half intrigued. Some whisper that Her Majesty herself has given permission for a little experimentation, as long as it is conducted behind closed doors and not in view of the Archbishop of Canterbury. Inevitably, someone takes things a step too far. Lord Elgin, never one to miss a trend, sniffs a bit too deeply and must be helped to the chaise longue by 3 footmen and a highly amused Princess Alice. Across the table, the Countess of Fife dissolves into giggles, accidentally spilling syllabub into a priceless inkwell. In the next room, a junior equerry is discovered composing poetry to the royal corgis, who, if we're honest, have heard far worse. Protocol quickly crumbles. The master of ceremonies, whose job it is to keep the monarchy running on schedule, finds himself chasing after a group of lords determined to measure the acoustics of the grand staircase by how loudly they can sing God Save the Queen in falsetto. Etiquette books are hastily consulted, but they offer little advice on how to handle a peer of the realm who insists he's invented a new dance involving only knees. Through it all, Queen Victoria maintains an air of dignified bemusement. She's no stranger to medical innovation. After all, she famously endorsed chloroform for childbirth, to the horror of half the bishops in England. Perhaps she sees in ether a harmless escape for her court, a way for her tightly wound aristocrats to loosen their collars, and, for a few moments, forget about the demands of empire. Or perhaps she simply enjoys the spectacle of a visiting ambassador attempting to curtsy to a palm tree. Of course, discretion is key. Officially, no one at court partakes in anything more scandalous than a vigorous constitutional walk. Unofficially, rumours swirl. Did Prince Leopold really organise a midnight ether party? Was the Archbishop caught napping in the library with a suspiciously sweet-smelling kerchief? Did Queen Victoria herself ever take a whiff? The palace refuses to comment, but the effect is clear. For a brief, vaporous season, the monarchy isn't just the head of state, it's the epicenter of mayhem. The grandest rules bend. Laughter echoes through marble corridors, and even the stoniest dowager finds herself grinning at the memory of a night when Buckingham Palace belonged to progress, curiosity, and a tiny bottle of mischief. In the end, the courtiers compose themselves, the servants restore order, and the official record remains spotless. But behind the palace doors, a little cloud of rebellion lingers, a gentle reminder that even queens and kings sometimes need to let their hair down, and occasionally their guards too. No trend escapes the Victorian press. Once reporters catch on, ether becomes the latest headline scandal, usually wedged between a story about railway delays and an editorial about the dangers of jazz hands. At first, the newspapers are merely curious. Editors send out their most junior reporters to cover the strange new medical vapor being whispered about in the drawing rooms of Mayfair. A small blurb appears in the society column, neatly tucked beside news of Lady Haversham's poodle's birthday. The language is cautious. Certain advanced social circles have been observed to indulge in continental chemical amusements. The medical community is divided. Translation: no one knows what's happening, but someone's aunt fainted into the trifle. But things escalate quickly. A rival paper gets hold of a particularly juicy tidbit. A viscount, normally famous for his sobriety, was spotted attempting to conduct the orchestra at Covent Garden with a dessert spoon. Suddenly, ether is everywhere. Headlines scream, gaslight and gasps. The peril in our parlours, and society swoons. New fad sweeps London's elite. Cartoonists have a field day, filling pages with sketches of monocled baronets collapsing into bouquets and society dames declaring undying love for umbrella stands. Penny dreadfuls, always happy to sensationalize, seize on the trend, warning of ghostly apparitions and secret societies, all fueled by a whiff of ether. One particularly dramatic serial describes a masked ball that devolves into chaos after the host's soothing vapor turns the guests into a frenzied mob, dancing widdershins to the sound of invisible bagpipes. Middle-class parents are suddenly on high alert. Letters pour into the editors. Is our youth at risk? Will my daughter abandon her embroidery for ether? Asks one anxious mother, whose daughter, it must be said, was never much interested in embroidery to begin with. Public outrage follows the curiosity. Moral reformers, never ones to miss a crisis, take to the letters page. Is this the end of civilization? Asks Reverend Josiah Broome, warning that ether may lead not only to idleness, but, worse yet, to the French. The Times prints a sober editorial. We, as a nation, must ask ourselves whether progress is best measured by scientific discovery or by the ability to remain upright through supper. Satirical weeklies suggest a new parliamentary bill, the Proper Use of Handkerchiefs Act, 1848. Doctors are summoned to defend their profession. Some respond with robust letters of their own, decrying the ignorant panic-mongering of the yellow press. Others, more entrepreneurial, run discreet advertisements for genuine medical ether, as recommended by leading society physicians. Apothecaries see a spike in business, while simultaneously having to answer to nervous clients. No, madam, it will not cause your husband to develop delusions about the neighbour's goose. Meanwhile, society figures attempt to weather the storm with varying degrees of success. Some, ever practical, simply hire publicists. Others try to claim they never liked ether, having always preferred a brisk walk and a glass of sherry. The most daring double down, hosting educational evenings on the wonders of chemistry, strictly for scientific purposes, of course. A rumour surfaces that the Duchess of Pembridge has agreed to demonstrate the responsible use of ether, only to be found napping mid-lecture with her spectacles askew. But scandal, as ever, is a double-edged sword. For every stern rebuke, there's a curious new guest at the next ether gathering. Young men try to outdo each other in procuring the most exclusive vapors. Young women start adding experimental chemistry to their list of accomplishments. The press, despite its warnings, can't resist covering each new escapade in lavish, occasionally hysterical detail. Circulation soars, and so the ether craze burns ever brighter, fanned by the breathless attention of London's reporters. The public shakes its collective head, while secretly checking the society pages for the next outrageous tale. In Victorian England, scandal is never the end, it's only the beginning of the next sensation. So if you ever wondered why every new trend seems to last just a bit longer than common sense, thank the press. After all, no one writes a better love letter to disaster than a bored Victorian journalist. The church is not amused. Sermons warn of moral decay, and pamphlets circulate claiming ether will dissolve your sense of duty and possibly your eyebrows. For some, it's just more motivation to double up. Victorian England, for all its scientific pretensions, still kneels every Sunday in fear of hellfire, and the ether craze, with its vapours and visions, is raising more than a few ecclesiastical eyebrows. The first complaints come quietly. A bishop's secretary finds a perfumed handkerchief in the cathedral, and a rural vicar notices the congregation dozing through the homily, faces dreamy and suspiciously content. It isn't long before the pulpits thunder with concern. Sunday morning in 1848. The bells toll, the pews are full, and the reverend is in fine form. But there's something new in the sermon. A warning, couched in the language of righteous outrage. Beware the seductive vapor, for it is written, "Let not man seek false paradise in chemical fog." Congregants shift guiltily in their seats, unsure whether to confess, giggle, or just reach for the smelling salts. The church organist, who attended an ether party the night before, tries very hard not to fall asleep during the offertory. Pamphlets appear in the vestry. Ether, the devil's own perfume. They claim that ether clouds the soul, weakens the will, and invites all manner of foreign wickedness, by which they mostly mean French philosophy and unchaperoned laughter. The illustrations are lurid, skeletal hands passing bottles in the moonlight, society dames swooning directly into the clutches of cartoonish demons. The message is clear: sniff at your own peril. As with all good moral panics, the warnings are delightfully vague. Some preachers insist that ether is a gateway to ruin, leading inevitably to absinthe gambling and the purchase of unflattering hats. Others claim it's an invitation for the supernatural, a sure way to open one's spirit to poltergeists and improper dancing. One enthusiastic curate even declares that no soul can be saved while its owner is giggling at wallpaper. The response from the public is mixed. Some take the warnings to heart, swearing off ether in favor of more traditional pastimes, like complaining about the weather or attending extremely long prayer meetings. Others view the sermons as a challenge. After all, nothing makes a forbidden fruit more delicious than a vicar's disapproval. If God didn't want us to have ether, quips one dowager, he would have made the parlor less boring. Meanwhile, the clergy find themselves caught in a losing battle with curiosity and human nature. Confessionals fill with anxious whisperings. "Forgive me, Father, for I have sniffed." The church's stance becomes an accidental advertising campaign, and clever hosts begin holding spiritual improvement evenings that feature, between psalms, just a hint of experimental vapor. Yet, beneath the moralizing, there is genuine fear. Fear that society is changing too quickly for comfort. Ether represents more than a passing fad. It's the whiff of a new world, where pleasure and novelty compete with tradition and restraint. The old certainties are evaporating, much like the vapor itself. Still, the church soldiers on. The Sunday sermons grow longer, the pamphlets multiply. But by the time the final hymn rings out, half the congregation is dreaming of a lighter, brighter world, one where even the bishop might take a whiff, just to see what the fuss is about. In the end, ether doesn't destroy the soul. It just gives it something new to worry about. And in Victorian England, that's nearly a sacrament in itself. What goes up must come down. With rising addiction, ruined fortunes, and more than one embarrassing incident involving a bishop and a chaise lounge, the party is almost over. Almost. Morning breaks over Mayfair and the sunlight is pitiless. The grand houses are quieter now. Inside, the aftermath of last night's frolic is painfully clear. Wilted bouquets, toppled chairs, and a collection of aristocrats scattered like exhausted moths across velvet sofas. The air is heavy with the scent of overripe lilies and regret. No one is laughing now, not even the spaniel, who's hiding beneath the harpsichord with a look that says, "Never again." For those who indulged a little too often, the consequences are not just physical. The telltale signs of ether excess are impossible to ignore. There are headaches of a truly architectural variety, nausea that not even strong tea can cure, and a pervasive brain fog that makes remembering your own name feel like a parlor game. The footman brings in breakfast, dry toast and oranges for delicate stomachs, and is greeted by groans, requests for silence, and the occasional desperate plea for a doctor who won't judge. Fortunes, too, are suffering. That once impressive bottle collection on the mantelpiece is now a monument to poor decisions. Ether, though cheap in small doses, becomes ruinously expensive when ordered by the crate. Several of London's best families have quietly begun selling off heirlooms, a painting here, a second-best carriage there, anything to pay the bills before the creditors start knocking. The butlers keep a careful eye on the silverware. The housekeeper has noticed that Lady Blythe's pearls have vanished, and so has her memory of where she last left them. There is, inevitably, gossip. Society whispers behind gloved hands. It's not just the ether anymore. It's what happened while under its spell. Tales of scandal multiply. A dowager caught napping in the bishop's mitre, a future baronet found weeping over a wilted fern, and one memorable incident where Lord Redgrave tried to propose to a suit of armour. Every party has a price, and reputations are the first to be auctioned off. The family physician, once so enthusiastic, is now tight-lipped and weary. His patients are listless, irritable, and prone to mysterious rashes. He tries to taper them off the vapour, suggesting walks in the park and strong coffee. But the habit is stubborn. Some swear off ether entirely, vowing never to touch the stuff again until the next rainy evening, when the lure of just one more medicinal dose proves too strong. Even the servants, normally models of discretion, find their patience wearing thin. After weeks of chaos, they're dreaming of a house where guests faint only from boredom and the family heirlooms are used for their intended purpose. The cook refuses to make syllabub ever again. The butler has banned handkerchiefs from the dining room, and the parlour-maid eyes the ether decanter as if it might sprout legs and start trouble on its own. So, as the ether clouds begin to lift, high society surveys the damage. There are bruised egos, empty purses, and a sense that something has been lost. A little dignity, a lot of sleep, and perhaps the last illusion that progress comes without a price. But don't worry, it's not quite over yet. In true Victorian fashion, there's always room for one more round, one last toast, one more attempt to chase novelty before reality calls everyone home. For what is high society, if not stubbornly, spectacularly slow to learn? And what is an ether hangover, if not the universe's gentle reminder that even the loftiest salons can end up on the floor? Ether addiction wasn't just a social inconvenience, it became a medical crisis. As more upper-crust Victorians sought help, or were sent by their mortified families, doctors began to realize that not every problem could be solved by more ether. It starts with a discreet knock on the doctor's door. The patient arrives, bundled in a carriage, hidden behind tinted glass and a veil of shame. The family doctor, who 6 months earlier was singing the praises of miracle vapors, now sits stone-faced behind his desk, reviewing case notes written in a mix of optimism and panic. Symptoms: nervous exhaustion, absent-mindedness, inability to remain upright at dinner parties. Diagnosis: high society in crisis. The rehabilitation process is, predictably, Victorian. The patient is not sent to a spa, but rather to a relative's country house, far from temptation and the scandalous gaze of London. The prescription: fresh air, brisk walks, and, if the patient is very lucky, hot chocolate instead of ether. Family members take turns providing moral support, though many prefer to watch from a safe distance, wary of catching whatever affliction comes from too many evenings lost in chemical bliss. Withdrawal is not for the faint of heart. The body protests: headaches, chills, inexplicable urges to weep into the curtains. Patients become irritable, restless, and prone to staring moodily out of windows, searching the horizon for a lost sense of euphoria. There are journals full of rambling self-reflection, tearful declarations that this time truly, they're done with the vapor forever. Occasionally, someone attempts to barter with the gardener for a secret supply. The gardener, to his credit, pretends not to hear. The doctor, once a champion of modern chemistry, now advocates for the healing power of routine. A schedule is imposed: early mornings, hearty breakfasts, supervised walks, and absolutely no mysterious handkerchiefs at bedtime. If the patient can be kept occupied, preferably with healthy activities like sketching, fishing, or alphabetizing the family library, so much the better. The mind, the doctor intones, must be restored to equilibrium. No one asks if the doctor's own equilibrium is holding up. Of course, there are relapses. The temptation returns during thunderstorms, tedious afternoons, or when a well-meaning visitor brings a gift-wrapped medicinal tonic. The patient swears it's for nerves, just a drop, just this once. The cycle repeats. Family members sigh. The doctor scribbles new notes. Patient attempted to extract ether from lamp oil. Intervention. Brisk walk. Stern lecture. And the cook wonders how much longer she'll have to hide the vanilla essence. By now, word has spread among London's elite. Too much ether. And you may find yourself taking the waters in Bath, or forced to endure a summer in the Scottish Highlands with your least favourite aunt. Rumours circulate about secret asylums for nervous disorders, where the upper crust are reformed with a regimen of cold baths and moral essays. For most, the mere threat of exile to the countryside is motivation enough to at least pretend they're on the mend. Eventually, some recover. The mind clears, the appetite returns, and the very sight of an ether bottle inspires only vague nausea. There are promises never to touch the stuff again, at least not until the next irresistible fad comes along. And so, the Victorian approach to rehab is revealed for what it is. A mixture of medical guesswork, social pressure, and the eternal belief that everything can be cured by a change of scenery. One thing is certain, when the doctor will see you now, you're not getting ether. You're getting a long walk, a cup of tea, and a very pointed reminder that nothing is ever truly discreet in high society. Suddenly, all those rules about forks and conversation seem less important when half your friends are face down on a divan. Victorian etiquette meets its match, and the result is a new kind of social chaos. For decades, etiquette books had been the backbone of high society. Weighty volumes detailing how to curtsy at precisely the right angle, where to place a lobster fork, and how to engage in conversation without ever mentioning bodily functions, strong emotion, or the existence of France. Hosts prided themselves on their impeccable manners, and guests lived in mortal terror of using the wrong spoon. Dignity, composure, and order were the currency of every good salon. But then came ether, and with it, the gentle collapse of every social rule that had ever been carved into mahogany. At first, hosts did their best to maintain appearances. The invitations were still handwritten in copperplate. The parlours were arranged with military precision, sofa here, tea tray there, fainting couch, just in case, discreetly tucked behind the aspidistra. Everyone arrived in their best gloves, and the opening conversation dutifully revolved around the weather, local politics, and how lovely Lady Elmsworth's begonias were this year. The trouble began with the handkerchiefs. At the first whiff of ether, polite conversation wobbled and collapsed. The Dowager Countess, a bastion of decorum, was soon discovered telling ghost stories to the butler. Lord Featherstone, normally incapable of laughter, was giggling at the antimacassars. Small talk about the Crimean War devolved into heated debates about whether the dog could be taught to play the harpsichord. Protocol, once so comforting, evaporated with the vapor. Etiquette books never covered what to do if a guest faints onto the tea trolley, or how to politely wake someone who has fallen asleep in the umbrella stand. No chapter addressed the correct response to a poetry recital delivered while hanging upside down from the library ladder. The advice on avoiding scandal was largely silent on the issue of spontaneous charades involving the furniture. The staff did their best to preserve order. Maids quietly swept up broken teacups and removed unconscious guests to the music room for recuperation. But even they had to admit that the usual boundaries were dissolving. Servants who once never spoke above a whisper in company were now quietly wagering which guest would be the first to try and converse with the goldfish. And then there were the apologies. The next morning, the most common activity in Mayfair was the writing of carefully phrased notes. So sorry for the incident with the pudding, or apologies if I inadvertently recited Tennyson at the Potted Palms. Etiquette manuals were hastily amended, adding footnotes for unusual merriment and unexpected horizontal guests. For some, The collapse of rigid social order was liberating. People discovered they could survive an evening without following all the rules, and sometimes even enjoy themselves in the process. The salons grew noisier, laughter became a fixture, and the horror of public embarrassment faded as everyone realized that, this time, nobody had managed to keep their dignity entirely intact. Of course, there were casualties. The family silver suffered. Carpets bore mysterious stains, and the reputation of certain matrons would never fully recover. But by the time the ether craze began to wane, etiquette books were gathering dust, and the memory of those wild evenings had become the stuff of legend. In the end, it was clear that etiquette is no match for the law of unintended consequences, or for a society determined to chase novelty wherever it may lead, even if it's right under the fainting couch. Addiction has a price. Family fortunes shrink, inheritances evaporate, and that second home in Bath quietly gets sold. The only thing growing is your collection of empty bottles and regrets. In the heady early days, ether seemed harmless enough, a clever new amusement for the bored and the fashionable, a scientific party trick that cost less than a new hat and promised more excitement than yet another poetry reading. But as with all trends that sweep through the drawing rooms of the wealthy, the costs began to mount. At first, it was just a matter of a few extra pounds to the apothecary, a tip to the discreet chemist, or the price of another monogrammed ether flask for your collection. Nothing the estate couldn't absorb. But fads, especially intoxicating ones, never stay modest for long. What starts as an occasional indulgence turns into a weekly ritual, then a daily necessity. Households that once prided themselves on frugality now find themselves ordering ether by the crate. The apothecary's ledger swells with aristocratic names, and some chemists begin to offer discounts for regular customers. Always a bad sign. Even the butler, ever discreet, notices that the liquor bills are down, but the ether bills have climbed alarmingly high. The financial impact creeps in, silent as a butler's footstep. Heirlooms, once displayed with pride, start disappearing. First to go is the silver tea service, temporarily pawned to pay a lingering account. Then, a family portrait loaned to a distant cousin, never to return. By the time anyone notices the missing candelabra, the money has already vanished. The drawing rooms are just as grand, but the underlying wealth has sprung a leak. Inheritance, that sacred Victorian institution, is suddenly less of a guarantee. The next generation, who once expected to inherit acres of rolling countryside, now find themselves the proud owners of little more than a few moth-eaten carpets and a mountain of unpaid bills. Letters are sent to old friends asking about business opportunities. Daughters, who might have hoped for titled suitors, are quietly encouraged to consider anyone with reliable income, even if he does something as vulgar as work. Social status, ever fragile, starts to wobble. The most extravagant ether enthusiasts become cautionary tales, whispered about over weak tea. Did you hear about Lord Fernwick? Sold his favourite spaniel just to keep up with his apothecary. Debts are delicately described as temporary setbacks, and the annual trip to the continent is cancelled in favour of healthful country air. Meanwhile, the next ether party is somehow never in short supply. Reputation, too, is a form of currency, and just as easily spent. The gossip sheets thrive on stories of formerly wealthy families brought low by their own excess. Ether ruins heiress. Scream the headlines. Dinner invitations dry up for the most notorious offenders, and new faces appear at parties. Upstart industrialists with suspiciously full wallets and not a whiff of vapor about them. There are those who weather the storm, who manage to pull back from the brink and save the family name, usually by disposing of the last few bottles and sending certain relatives abroad for their nerves. But for many, the slide is unstoppable. Wealth built over generations dissolves in a single season of fashionable indulgence. The only reminders are the empty flasks tucked away in drawers, the faded invitations to parties that can no longer be thrown, and the lingering memory of a time when ruin wore silk gloves and everyone agreed to look the other way. For the ether generation, the greatest hangover isn't just in the head, but in the accounts, a legacy of loss, a lesson in excess, and a cautionary tale written in disappearing ink. Not everyone saw ether as a disaster. Some of the era's greatest writers and painters swore it helped them see new worlds. Of course, they were also seeing dancing raccoons in the wallpaper, but that's just inspiration. In a time when nearly every respectable Victorian household boasted at least one poet and a fainting couch, it was only a matter of time before ether leapt from the drawing room to the garret studio. Suddenly, creative types, those who had always looked a little dazed anyway, found themselves in possession of a new muse, delivered in a tiny glass bottle. The effect was immediate. Journals filled with wild sketches, poems written in the margins of cookbooks, and at least one unfinished symphony composed entirely on the triangle. Take, for example, the case of Percy Marshwood, a minor painter with a major collection of empty bottles. Marshwood's reputation for gloomy landscapes was eclipsed overnight by a sudden burst of ether-induced productivity. Friends who visited his studio were treated to enormous canvases of clouds shaped like mythological beasts, and a controversial self-portrait that critics described as both alarming and, strangely, upside down. Marshwood insisted the clouds spoke to him and that he was simply documenting their side of the conversation. Writers, too, embraced the vapor. Society's most fashionable salons were soon hosting ether evenings, where aspiring poets competed to recite their latest verses before the vapor wore off. The results were mixed. Some verses soared to previously unimagined heights of feeling and imagery. Others consisted of nothing but the phrase, "I am a turnip," repeated for 12 stanzas. Audiences, equally inspired, or perhaps equally confused, applauded everything with the same enthusiasm. Among novelists, ether was rumored to be the secret behind a wave of wildly imaginative fiction. Plots twisted in impossible directions, characters changed species mid-chapter, and at least one heroine rode off into the sunset on a giant talking cabbage. Publishers, initially baffled, began marketing these books as adventures in the new literary etherism. Sales boomed. The critics, out of self-preservation, simply called it modern. Of course, not all artistic efforts ended in triumph. The composer Geraldina Nash, after an evening spent communing with her metronome, declared she had written the music of the spheres. When performed, the piece was described by the audience as bracing, confusing, and an effective alarm for pets. Sculptors claimed ether helped them see shapes hidden within the marble, though one regrettable bust was later discovered to be an accidentally glued pile of egg cups. Critics and society alike were divided. Some declared ether a divine gift to creativity, opening the mind's eye and freeing the spirit from the dreariness of daily life. Others pointed out that, historically, most masterpieces had been produced on little more than strong tea and lack of sleep. Letters to the Times alternated between praise for the daring genius of our ether-inspired artists and complaints that too many novels now featured talking wallpaper. Inevitably, as with all things Victorian, the fashion burned brightly but briefly. Soon enough, the salons returned to safer amusements, and the ether bottles migrated back to medicine cabinets or were quietly buried in the garden. The artists who survived the era did so with stories, some embarrassing, some dazzling, all vivid, but for a brief, swirling moment, the world was stranger, the art bolder, and inspiration just a sniff away. Ether may have faded from the studio, but the memory lingers, as do a few unfinished canvases and the immortal line, "My darling, I swear the wallpaper winked at me." Once the doctors sobered up, the warnings began. Medical journals filled with horror stories, and Parliament started muttering about regulation. The age of carefree sniffing was coming to an end. At first, the backlash is gentle. Little more than a cautionary note slipped into the back of the Lancet. Cases of ether excess have been observed, the report reads, in that understated medical tone that makes everything sound vaguely like a gardening accident. Society mostly ignores these hints, too busy worrying about waistcoat buttons and whether the cook has been skimping on the anchovy paste. But the incidents pile up. There are fainting spells in public gardens, reports of minor explosions involving ether and ill-placed gas lamps, and a disturbing increase in people convinced that the family tortoise is reciting Shakespeare. When Lord Derby is found sleepwalking down Pall Mall in nothing but a cravat, the matter can no longer be brushed aside. Suddenly, every house in London is abuzz with anxious speculation. Is ether safe? Should it be kept away from children, the elderly, and anyone who has ever tried to make toast using only a fireplace poker? The medical establishment, never keen on admitting a collective blunder, swings into action. Eminent physicians, many of whom once cheerfully prescribed ether for everything from sore throats to marital boredom, now pen furious letters to the editor. Ether, a menace to moral and physical health, declares one. The perils of vaporous amusement, warns another. Society physicians begin distancing themselves, assuring worried clients that their own ether is strictly medicinal, and that Lady Farquhar's incident with the window box was an unfortunate misunderstanding. Parliament, always eager to be seen as protecting the public, especially when elections are near, wades in. There are debates, heated and lengthy, about the threat posed by chemical amusements. Committees are formed. Questions are asked. Might ether, one MP inquires, undermine the moral backbone of the empire? No one knows for certain, but everyone agrees that something must be done. The idea of a tax on ether is floated, then dropped when someone points out the nation's reliance on nervous tonics during parliamentary sessions. Meanwhile, the newspapers, having just finished fueling the craze, switch sides with breathtaking speed. Case studies fill the columns. Lady Harrington, once a picture of poise, now unable to attend dinner parties without being gently propped against the sideboard. Cartoonists draw society matrons in a cloud of vapor, chasing their own hats through Hyde Park. Even the penny dreadfuls get in on the act, describing wild scenes of vapor-induced mayhem and promising that tonight's installment contains 3 actual medical opinions and a chase scene involving a startled bishop. Households, newly alarmed, begin locking away their bottles and eyeing any guest who sniffs a little too enthusiastically at the centerpiece. The apothecaries, now the target of muttered accusations and nervous glances, quietly remove their most flamboyant displays. Even the most stalwart ether fans begin to reconsider, especially when reminded that Queen Victoria herself has reportedly switched to smelling salts by royal decree. In a matter of weeks, the public mood changes. What was once a harmless amusement becomes a sign of recklessness, or worse, social decline. The parties dwindle. Invitations grow vague. The ether craze, once so unstoppable, now fades under a cloud of suspicion, shame, and the faint smell of disinfectant. But if Victorian society was quick to panic, it was also quick to forget. Soon, some new novelty would sweep the city, and ether would be relegated to that long, colourful list of unfortunate but instructive fads. Until then, Londoners nursed their hangovers, counted their fingers, and congratulated themselves on surviving yet another chapter in the never-ending saga of public health panics. Ether addiction may have faded, but the search for the next fashionable fix never stopped. Soon, Victorians were lining up for cocaine tooth drops, laudanum tonics, and whatever else promised to numb the existential dread of being really rich and really bored. As the ether craze fizzled out, snuffed by scandal, regulation, and the lingering scent of burnt upholstery, the great machine of Victorian novelty spun on undeterred. The city's chemists, always quick to adapt, swapped their ether bottles for new marvels. Laudanum, a potent tincture of opium, was suddenly the must-have for headaches, heartbreak, and inconveniently long sermons. Housewives dabbed it behind their ears before dinner parties. Poets swore by it. Even the family dog, if unlucky enough to catch a cold, might end up with a dose. Not to be outdone, the pharmaceutical world rolled out a dizzying parade of bottled solutions for life's many woes. Cocaine tooth drops for teething infants? Why not? Recommended by the Queen's own dentist, no less. Just a dab on the gum, the adverts chirped, and Junior will smile for hours. Children's cough syrups were laced with morphine. Nerve tonics promised instant relief for hysteria, lassitude, or ennui. There was even Vin Mariani, a fortified wine spiked with coca leaves, championed by popes, writers, and anyone who fancied feeling both blessed and bulletproof. The Victorians loved a quick fix, especially when it came in a handsome bottle with a gold-embossed label. Doctors, eager to keep pace and profits, became enthusiastic pitchmen. Newspapers were filled with glowing testimonials from satisfied customers. No longer does my husband weep at the sight of boiled mutton, or since taking Mrs. Pettigrew's invigorating cordial, my mother-in-law is almost tolerable. It's hard to tell where the advertising ended and the social experiment began. The social scene adjusted seamlessly. Ether parties gave way to laudanum picnics and medicinal wine tastings. Hosts hired pianists to play dreamy sonatas while guests reclined on cushions, passing little bottles and exchanging tips on how best to disguise the bitter aftertaste. New etiquette dilemmas arose. Was it polite to bring your own opium pipe to a dinner party? How many drops of tonic were too many before attempting the quadrille? What, exactly, should one say to a guest who had mistaken the umbrella stand for a confidant? Of course, problems persisted, just with new packaging. The medical journals, ever reactive, soon filled with warnings. There were anxious debates about cough syrup dependency, excessive use of invigorating stimulants, and peculiar behaviours at the Poetry Society. Parliament, somewhat sheepishly, considered new regulations. Chemists quietly removed the most colourful elixirs from their front displays, moving them to a back shelf labelled "for special customers only." But the thirst for distraction was impossible to quench. The next trend was always just over the horizon. Some claimed to have discovered the health benefits of electricity, mild shocks to invigorate the mind. Others extolled the virtues of mineral waters, sea air, or daily ice baths. There were diets involving little more than watercress and hope. There were spiritualists, mesmerists, and doctors who prescribed vigorous calisthenics while standing on your head. Yet, for all the medical marvels, nothing quite recaptured the giddy chaos of the ether era. The thrill of not knowing what might happen next, the delicious absurdity of high society utterly unmoored, was unique. A perfect storm of wealth, curiosity, and just enough denial to keep everyone coming back for more. So the Victorians moved on, always seeking, always sampling, never quite satisfied. And as new fads blossomed and faded, one truth remained. History's greatest addiction is to novelty itself. The legacy of the ether craze lingers, half cautionary tale, half comedy of errors. Every time someone invents a new wellness trend or miracle cure, you can thank the Victorians for blazing the trail with style, absurdity, and a total lack of safety protocol. You can still feel its faint presence in the way we talk about health and happiness. Scientific advances, miracle remedies, and breakthrough solutions, all phrases the Victorians adored. They may have swapped vapor for vitamin supplements and electrotherapy for cold plunges, but the urge is unchanged. A longing for something to fix life's persistent annoyances. Ether is gone from the drawing rooms, but its ghost wanders the shelves of modern pharmacies, peeking out from under the collagen gummies and detox teas. Stories from the era have taken on a mythic glow. Some say that ether fueled a golden age of creativity, while others insist it was nothing but trouble. If you listen closely, you can still hear whispers at society dinners. Tales of poets who claimed the vapor opened their minds to new universes, or aristocrats who woke up convinced they had danced all night with a herd of invisible giraffes. Like all the best historical disasters, the facts have blurred into legend, each retelling a little more dramatic and a little less plausible. Modern lessons abound, if you care to look. The first, and perhaps the simplest, is this. Human beings will do almost anything to escape boredom, even if it involves inhaling something that smells like burnt licorice and leaves you convinced your best friend is a potted fern. Progress, it turns out, is a double-edged sword. The same curiosity that leads to medical breakthroughs also leads to rooms full of very expensive people crawling under tables, looking for inspiration. Then there's the question of trust, particularly trust in science, doctors, and whatever the neighbour swears is the next big thing. The Victorians learned the hard way that expertise is not always the same as wisdom. For every life-saving advance, there was a parade of questionable advice, usually delivered by a man with wild hair and a certificate from a university no one had heard of. Ether's story is a reminder to ask not just, does it work? But also, what could possibly go wrong? The social angle is equally instructive. Ether's popularity spread through drawing rooms, dinner parties, and the irresistible power of groupthink. If the Duchess tried it, so did everyone else. A generation later, nothing had really changed. Trends still sweep through society, propelled by curiosity, envy, and the sheer thrill of joining in. Whether it's a Victorian vapor or a 21st century juice cleanse, the herd instinct is alive and well. But maybe the greatest lesson is this. No matter how absurd things get, people have an astonishing capacity to adapt, recover, and eventually laugh at their own disasters. The salons that once overflowed with ether-induced chaos settled back into order. The reputation of the silverware recovered, mostly. Even the most embarrassing tales became dinner party fodder, softened by time and retelling. So the next time you see a wellness trend trending, remember the Victorians. Remember their optimism, their spectacular blunders, and the lingering ghost of ether, forever haunting the margins of every miracle cure. If history teaches us anything, it's that we are rarely as wise as we hope, but usually a lot more entertaining than we intend. And somewhere, behind the curtain, there's still a faint whiff of vapor, just waiting for the next brave soul to take a sniff and start the whole comedy again. As the ether clouds fade and the party winds down, you find yourself grateful for fresh air, a sturdy mattress, and the fact that modern medicine now comes with warning labels. But somewhere, a distant echo of laughter reminds you, history's most ridiculous disasters always make the best bedtime stories. It's late in Victorian London. The carriages have rattled away, leaving behind a trail of muddled memories and the faint scent of burnt lace. The great houses are quiet again. Just the tick of clocks, the creak of floorboards, and perhaps the gentle snore of a baronet who hasn't quite made it home to his own bed. Downstairs, the servants tidy up the last traces of mayhem. Empty bottles tucked away, spilled punch quietly mopped from the Turkish rug, and ether-soaked handkerchiefs hung out to dry in the crisp night air. You, a survivor of the era's most fashionable chaos, are finally alone in your chamber. The mattress sags a little, the fire flickers low, and outside the window a pale mist rises off the city. You breathe deeply. Just plain oxygen. No special additives. Your mind drifts to the absurdities of the night. Uncles who mistook the lampshade for a helmet. A dowager countess swearing her corset could sing. And that persistent rumour about the Queen's footman reciting Latin to the goldfish. Victorian sleep, much like Victorian life, is a mixed blessing. The beds are softer than a stone floor, but only just. Your pillow is filled with feathers, or possibly the family goose. The nightgown is scratchy, but it's yours. For once, you're blissfully free of vapour, scandal, and anyone threatening to read you experimental poetry. Outside, the the city finally grows quiet. No more clinking glasses or spontaneous outbursts of the poker. You close your eyes, letting the day's noise ebb away. Maybe your heart is still pounding from too much laughter, or from trying to escape the attentions of an ether-inspired suitor. But here, in the quiet dark, you have time to reflect on how strange people can be, on the fads that rise and fall, and on the simple miracle of an uneventful night. If you listen closely, you can hear the slow, collective sigh of a society exhausted by its own inventiveness. Upstairs, the family dreams of better times and more sensible hobbies. Downstairs, the staff dreams of a week without chemical spills. Even the cat, curled by the hearth, finally relaxes, safe from swooning guests and the occasional airborne canapé. And so, you tuck yourself in and give thanks for the lamp that glows without open flame, for the tea that doesn't require a prescription, and for the knowledge that, at least tonight, your greatest risk is a slightly cold foot, not an accidental explosion. In a world still wobbling between progress and folly, the chance to simply rest feels like the ultimate luxury. As you drift off, the shadows on the wall settle into ordinary shapes, and the memories of Victorian excess turn soft and distant, like stories told in the glow of a dying fire. Tomorrow, the world will invent new troubles and fresh amusements. But tonight, you are safe, blanketed in quiet, watched over by the ghosts of 1,000 well-intentioned disasters. Sleep tight, don't sniff the vapors, and may your dreams be free of both fainting couches and impromptu science experiments. Because the past may be strange, but at least bedtime is still, mostly, sacred. It's opening night at the Royal Opera, and every noble in London is squeezed into boxes tighter than their waistcoats. But instead of swooning at the soprano, everyone's clutching lace handkerchiefs doused in ether. By intermission, half the audience is giggling at the chandeliers. The conductor has forgotten which opera they're performing, and at least one duke is convinced the second act is a personal hallucination. Picture the scene. London's cultural elite, dressed in shimmering silk and velvet, parading up the marble steps with all the solemnity of a royal funeral. The opera house is ablaze with gaslight, the air thick with expensive perfume, and the rustle of programs printed on paper so fine it could serve as a dinner roll in a pinch. A hush falls as the curtain rises. The prima donna appears, her voice soaring to the rafters, but attention wavers because, tonight, something new is stealing the show. Word has spread among the cognoscenti. Ether is the must-have accessory of the season. Its effects are said to make any experience transcendent, which, for the opera, is considered both a promise and a threat. By the time the overture begins, half the crowd is already partaking. Delicate sniffles echo through the gallery as lace handkerchiefs flutter from box to box. More contagious than any yawn or cough. It doesn't take long for decorum to dissolve. The baritone's aria is interrupted by fits of laughter from a box usually reserved for judges. In the stalls, a viscount whispers that he can see the music and spends most of the act staring intently at the violin section. Across the aisle, Lady Penelope is so taken with the color of the curtains that she misses an entire duet. The orchestra bravely carries on, even as one of the cellists succumbs to an uncontrollable case of the giggles. Backstage, word of the audience's altered state spreads quickly. The soprano, convinced her performance has never been more inspired, receives applause so thunderous and oddly timed that she suspects a second encore might require a medical team. The tenor, always quick to seize a trend, requests a discreet sniff before the final act, reasoning that if the critics are incapacitated, no review can possibly be bad. By intermission, chaos reigns. The grand foyer, meant for genteel conversation and discreet flirting, is now a carnival of confusion. A duke attempts to order oysters from a statue. The matron of a prominent family is seen debating philosophy with the coat rack. Footmen ferry smelling salts and strong tea through the crowd. But it's no use. Ether has turned London's most dignified night out into a gently swirling masquerade of nonsense. Meanwhile, the opera management is at its wit's end. The manager contemplates adding a new warning to the program. Please refrain from vaporous indulgence during dramatic areas. Ushers do their best to keep order, gently waking those who have drifted off mid-quartet, and encouraging patrons to clap only when the music actually ends. But tradition has surrendered to trend. When the final curtain falls, it does so to a standing ovation, a feat achieved mostly because no one can remember whether they're meant to sit or stand. The critics stagger home, their reviews full of poetic confusion. Never before has Ida seemed so perpendicular. Rumors of the night's debauchery travel swiftly, and the opera house secures its place in the annals of both high culture and high farce. Thus, the opera house incident goes down in history. A cautionary tale for the ages. A masterclass in what happens when ether and elegance collide, and proof that even the finest arts are no match for the absurdity of human curiosity. Victorian clubs were all about exclusivity, until someone started an ether appreciation society with weekly meetings, questionable snacks, and a sign-up sheet for experimental volunteers. Doctors gave lectures between fits of giggles, while respectable matrons tried to decide whether the side effects included sudden ballroom dancing. Spoiler, they did. It began innocently enough in the smoky back rooms of London's most prestigious gentlemen's clubs, the Athenaeum, the Reform, even the stuffy Travellers' Club, places where members usually argued about parliamentary procedure and the relative merits of snipe shooting. But with the ether craze in full swing, a few forward thinkers decided it was time for a more progressive gathering. Thus, the Ether Sniffing Society was born. Membership was by invitation only, though in practice, a well-timed anecdote about one's last ether experience was the fastest route in. The rules were simple. Bring your own handkerchief. Don't set fire to the upholstery. And try to remain vertical at least until the first lecture concluded. Meetings took place in a haze of cigar smoke and competitive nervous laughter. Bowls of questionable snacks, pickled walnuts, anchovy biscuits, and a mysterious cheese from the continent were on hand for those with a strong constitution. Each gathering featured a guest speaker, usually a doctor or chemist, who claimed to have studied the effects of ether extensively, though their research notes were often suspiciously wine-stained and smelled faintly of vapor. They presented their findings with the solemnity of a parliamentary debate, pausing only for dramatic sniffing breaks. One memorable evening featured Dr. Ambrose Snell, who argued, mid-giggle, that ether was the very cornerstone of modern social advancement. Half the audience agreed. The other half forgot the topic and spent the rest of the night counting the ceiling tiles. The society was not limited to men. In time, it became so fashionable that even the most proper matrons insisted on attending, chaperoned, of course, by their most responsible niece or an unimpressed clergyman. The result was a uniquely Victorian blend of scientific inquiry and unchecked silliness. One matron, Lady Duckworth, famously declared after her second dose that she could now see the future, and it involved far fewer corsets. Experiments, such as they were conducted with great ceremony. Some members claimed to have unlocked the secrets of the universe. Others merely developed a strong attachment to the club's stuffed owl mascot. There were attempts to measure the duration and quality of ether-induced euphoria, but the only consistent finding was that it made people unusually interested in reciting Latin, arm wrestling, or debating whether the room was spinning clockwise or anti-clockwise. Of course, not all went according to plan. One disastrous meeting ended with the club president stuck halfway out a window, convinced he was auditioning for the opera. Another evening saw the society banned from the Reform Club for excessive merriment and unlicensed cartwheeling. Rumor had it that several prominent members' wives, after investigating, returned home with the firm conviction that men could not be left alone with either ether or cheese for more than half an hour. As word spread, copycat societies popped up all over town, each vying for the title of most enlightened or, failing that, least likely to be prosecuted for public disturbance. Eventually, the ether-sniffing society faded with the fad, but the memory lingered, alongside a few scorch marks on the carpet and a collective sense of awe at how quickly science could go sideways in the wrong company. In the end, the society stands as a monument to Victorian ambition and eccentricity, proof that no matter how exclusive the club, you're only ever a whiff away from glorious nonsense. Getting your portrait painted used to mean hours of sitting absolutely motionless. Enter ether, the new relaxant. Suddenly, society portraitists are fielding commissions from clients who can't keep their eyes open and occasionally fall out of their chairs mid-pose. The results? Let's just say that the 1850s were a golden age for half-finished faces and accidental cubism. Imagine it. You're in the grand, drafty studio of a fashionable painter. Sunlight filters through grimy windows, picking out clouds of turpentine and anticipation. The artist, all wild hair and smudged waistcoat, flourishes his brushes. You, dressed in your best satin or starch, settle onto the posing chair, a throne of discomfort. Hold perfectly still, the painter commands. Try to look both dignified and thoughtful. You nod. Your spine protests. The clock ticks. The tea goes cold. For generations, these portrait sessions were a feat of endurance. Models practiced meditative breathing, daydreamed about dinner, or tried to transcend their aching muscles. One misplaced twitch and the artist would sigh, repaint, or, if you were unlucky, start again entirely. It was a trial by boredom, with a prize of immortality, and sometimes a suspiciously long nose. But then ether entered the scene. No longer was stillness a torment, it was a side effect. Society, ever eager for an easier route to posterity, embraced the relaxant with open arms. Sitters arrived with handkerchiefs discreetly scented, confident they could breeze through the ordeal. Portraitists, initially skeptical, quickly adapted. If the client snored, it was simply a new kind of artistic repose. Ether transformed the experience. Some subjects became so tranquil they nearly merged with the furniture, staring off into space with expressions of blissful confusion. The artist would occasionally have to prod a patron awake, hoping to finish the eyes before their subject drifted entirely out of the frame. Lord Fitzwilliam's portrait became famous for its dreamy gaze. Rumour had it he was pondering the nature of existence, but in reality, he'd just forgotten his own name. Of course, mishaps abounded. Some etherized clients, moments before the crucial sitting, would suddenly erupt in giggles, lose all sense of balance, or slide from the chair in slow motion. Children, brought in to be immortalized for family posterity, grew limp as rag dolls and had to be propped up with cushions and a helpful maid out of view. At least one portrait session ended with the sitter facing entirely the wrong direction, producing a thoughtful rear view that critics praised as boldly modern. The trend even reached the heights of artistic fashion. Society pages breathlessly reported on the new serenity seen in the faces of London's elite. "Such composure," gushed one review, "such innovative use of drool." Portraitists, emboldened by the demand, experimented with softer lines and vaguer backgrounds, just in case their subject wobbled or faded away mid-pose. But beneath the novelty, not everyone was pleased. A few old-school artists grumbled that true character could not be captured through chemistry. "A portrait must reveal the soul," one declared, "not just a relaxed jawline." Family matriarchs worried that children immortalized under the influence might appear too cheerful, or worse, slightly cross-eyed. Rumors spread that the Queen herself had banned the practice in royal sittings, although several courtiers' paintings seemed suspiciously dreamy. Inevitably, like all fads, the ether portrait craze faded. Artists quietly went back to demanding stillness and patience. Clients resumed their stoic suffering, and everyone agreed not to mention the unfortunate Floating Earl series. Still, a few dreamy, gently lopsided portraits remain, a testament to the age when a little vapor promised beauty, ease, and, for once, the art of not minding the weight. All good things and disastrous vices come to an end. One foggy week, the city's ether supply runs dangerously low. Socialites begin to panic. Fights break out at the apothecary. Black market bottles circulate in silk handbags. Desperate nobles send footmen on midnight errands, and rumours swirl that the Duchess of Wrexham has started sniffing turpentine just to take the edge off. It begins with a single, innocent phrase uttered by a distracted chemist. "I'm afraid we're out of ether, madam." At first, society doesn't quite register the significance. After all, shortages happen. There were the great ice cream famine of 43 and the tragic gin drought of 39. But ether? Surely such a modern marvel would flow forever. Yet as the days pass, anxious whispers ripple through London's parlours and ballrooms. The apothecaries are besieged. Well-dressed customers queue before dawn, clutching empty flasks and ever more creative stories of medical need. The chemists, faced with a stampede of anxious clients, begin rationing what little stock remains: an ounce for Lady Thornton's nerves, half a dram for the vicar's spiritual exercises. When word gets out that supplies are running low, tempers flare. Lady Jessup, normally the soul of composure, is spotted wrestling a rival for the last bottle, her ostrich plume askew and her dignity nowhere to be seen. Desperation breeds innovation. Resourceful butlers strike up covert deals with understocked dispensaries, while enterprising footmen are dispatched on midnight scavenger hunts. The black market booms. Unlabeled bottles are sold in shadowy corners, the sellers swearing it's the real thing, and not just gin mixed with eucalyptus. Scented handkerchiefs are guarded more closely than family heirlooms. Lady Pembleton even installs a lockbox for her vapour supplies. Guarded by a pug with an unusually fierce bark, parties take on a frantic new edge. The old etiquette, first come, first served, gives way to thinly veiled subterfuge. Guests arrive early, hoping to stake a claim, and keep a wary eye on the decanter. Hosts attempt to water down the vapour with rosewater or cologne, but the results are dismal and the complaints legendary. Sir Bernard attempts to concoct his own substitute, resulting in a house full of sneezing guests and a parlour that smells of menthol for weeks. As the crisis drags on, the city's mood sours, rumours swirl. Did the Duchess of Wrexham truly resort to sniffing turpentine? Is the Prince Consort hoarding ether in the palace cellars? Who exactly is the mysterious Vapour King now seen loitering outside the Opera House, offering small phials to desperate debutantes? The newspapers have a field day, publishing helpful tips like breathing deeply, a safe alternative, and warning of a rise in accidental inhalations of lamp oil. The creative classes, robbed of their inspiration, declare a citywide malaise. No new poetry is written. Artists gaze blankly at their canvases. One famously melancholic playwright refuses to get out of bed, sending notes by footman, no vapour, no Hamlet. Society, unmoored from its favourite vice, tries to fill the void with tea, card games, and, in one ill-fated instance, a revival of interpretive dance. Just as panic threatens to become permanent, a new shipment arrives from the continent. The crisis ends as suddenly as it began. Ether is rationed, then flows freely once more. London's parlours are filled with laughter, music, and relief. The shortage is remembered as both a trauma and a farce, fuel for gossip, for plays, and for one particularly memorable masquerade ball in which the entire theme was survival of the wittiest. The great ether shortage becomes legend, proof that society, when deprived of its comforts, can be both ingenious and absolutely ridiculous. The authorities have had enough. Parliament debates, doctors weep, and a coalition of mothers marches on Westminster, waving pamphlets and empty vials. As new laws loom, the die-hard ether crowd throws one last delirious bash, complete with secret knock, coded invitations, and a string quartet valiantly playing through clouds of chemical vapours. By sunrise, the era is over, but the stories are just getting started. It begins with a whisper in the House of Commons. Regulation. At first, society barely notices. Parliament has threatened to ban everything from seditious pamphlets to overly enthusiastic bagpipes, after all. But this time, the mood is different. Doctors publish alarming studies. The Times runs editorials titled, "Is Civilization in Danger?" Moral reformers thunder from the pulpit. Even Queen Victoria's corgis look wary. The writing is on the wall, and it smells faintly of medicinal vapor. The news spreads like spilled punch at a garden party. Invitations to ether gatherings become more clandestine, passed with a wink and a flourish. The city's best hostesses vie for the honor of holding the last true ether frolic, each trying to outdo the next with more elaborate themes, costumed footmen, and tableaux vivants, featuring local poets who may or may not have any idea where they are. Entry is by password only, herbal infusion, and the guests whisper of a secret contest. Who will be the last to faint? Inside these vanishing salons, the atmosphere is bittersweet, a wild mix of nostalgia, bravado, and gallows humor. Some guests swear they'll never give up their handkerchiefs, even if it means smuggling them to the continent. Others, more pragmatic, tuck in for a final round of revelry, determined to make it one for the history books. Ether is rationed, cherished, and, in one memorable incident, auctioned off in exchange for a priceless snuff box and a signed portrait of Lord Byron's footman. The musicians do their best, playing waltzes that grow ever more surreal as the vapor thickens. Poets improvise odes to lost evenings and forgotten names. Old feuds are patched up, old scandals revived, and one gentleman attempts a passionate declaration of love to a potted palm. Even the family dog is dressed for the occasion, resplendent in borrowed cravat and monocle. Outside, the world changes quickly. Parliament passes the ban with a minimum of fuss and a maximum of finger-wagging. Chemists remove ether from their shelves. Doctors lock their cabinets. Police raids make headlines. There are tales of last-minute dashes to Paris, coded telegrams, and the black market's brief, spectacular boom. The city's ether elite, so recently at the center of fashion, now find themselves relics overnight, exiled to the footnotes of polite society. But as with all great finales, there is both loss and laughter. Ether, for all its chaos, gave a generation stories they would tell for years. The legend of the last ether ball grows with every retelling. A chandelier swung by a viscount, a duchess who recited the Iliad backwards, and a butler who, for one glorious moment, conducted the orchestra using only his eyebrows. And when the sun finally rises over a quieter, cleaner London, the last of the vapor drifts away, replaced by tea, sobriety, and the odd pang of nostalgia. High society straightens its gloves, repairs its reputations, and prepares for whatever madness comes next. The final curtain falls, not with a crash, but with a sigh, a giggle, and the soft rustle of silk as the aristocrats of old learn, at last, to face the morning without a chemical crutch. Ether is gone, but its story lingers. A wisp of rebellion, a cautionary tale, and an unintentional comedy for the ages. So tonight, as you drift off in your clean bed, surrounded by the quiet hum of electricity and absolutely zero vaporized party drugs, take a slow, grateful breath. Spare a moment for the ancestors who survived centuries of medical fads, social disasters, and whatever passed for wellness in the age of the corset. Remember, history's most fashionable disasters were just people. People who were bored, curious, and sometimes a little too eager to trust a glass bottle handed to them at a party. You've survived an evening in the heart of Victorian high society. Watched the finest minds of the age pass out in parlours, and seen fortunes vanish faster than a sniff at a masquerade. You've witnessed the dignity of the upper class dissolve into giggles, confusion, and, occasionally, spontaneous waltzing with the curtains, all in the name of keeping up with the latest trend, all while pretending that nothing out of the ordinary was happening. But through all the scented fog and accidental arson, there's something stubbornly impressive about it. The resilience of people trying to feel a little less alone, a little more alive, even if it meant making a complete mess of things in the process. The Victorians may have lost their grip on sobriety, etiquette, and common sense, but not their flair for drama. So, as you tuck yourself in tonight, let yourself be quietly thankful for modern medicine, safety labels, and the miracle of waking up tomorrow with all your dignity and your eyebrows still intact. The people of the past may have been outrageous, confused, and deeply misguided, but they were also endlessly inventive and, let's be honest, kind of hilarious. Because history isn't just a record of suffering or triumph. It's proof that people are stubborn, hopeful, and above all, gloriously ridiculous. Good night, sleep well, and may your dreams be free of both fainting couches and spontaneous Victorian raves.